Welcome to the Public Voice Salon. We are an open dialogue on education, the arts, and social change. My name is John Braden. My lovely wife, Claudia, is filming us. And today we're so excited to be with Dr. Lawrence Kramer, my former professor here at Fordham University Lincoln Center campus. And so this will be a first. This is the first time we ever had a former professor of mine on the show. And because Larry gave me an A, I don't think there should be a problem with that. Dr. Kramer has gone on to become one of the leading musicologists in our country. So today in this program, we're going to learn something about what is musicology, and also something about literature. I mean, this was a very important class that I took. It was actually one of my first classes. It was called Psychoanalysis in Literature. This was in 1986. I was new in terms of like trying to figure out in the academy, what am I going to major in? And there were all kinds of competing ideas. You know, should I study business and be practical? But I always had a love for literature since I was a little boy, and I wrote a short story when I was 8 years old, and I was, so I was sort of wrestling with these things. And then I took this class, Psychoanalysis in Literature with Dr. Kramer, and I was like, whoa, this is an incredible world to be a part of, the humanities. And you talked about Kafka and Freud, and we read Charlotte Bronte. So a little bit to our audience about why the humanities matter, especially now at a time in our country when we seem to be moving away from the humanities and young people are being told to be practical. Why the humanities matters, why literature matters, why these things matter to you, and how you relate that to musicology. I know it's a lot to cover, but it's going to be a delightful back and forth dialogue with Dr. Lawrence Kramer at Fordham University. So we'll start, and Larry, just introduce yourself to our audience, and we can begin.
Okay. Hello, audience. I will take the microphone and, prepare to, utter very wise and brilliant things in an unceasing stream.
As you're very good at, I know that. Believe me. Yes.
So, you just want me to talk about me? Well, okay, I will do that. So the interesting thing about me, to the extent that there is one, is this curious combination of being a professor of English at this university, but also a professor of music. My actual title is Distinguished Professor of English and Music, although my teaching is done primarily in English. And there are complicated reasons for that, but one of them touches upon what John was talking about in terms of his own history here. The thing that I do for the English department, particularly at the graduate level, is teach literary theory. Now, psychoanalysis and music falls into that category. That has not only been an interest of mine ever since graduate school, it is also something that when I turned to writing about music back in the 1980s, I brought into the musical stream of inquiry as well. So there are all kinds of connections between these particular disciplines. And so gradually, as time went by, my own interest carried me more and more into the musical arena. But I never, ever left literature behind. It's a kind of interesting juggling act. So 2 observations. The first is that when I first began writing about music, I began doing it in connection with poetry. And indeed, that's the title of my first book, Music and Poetry. And in that particular context, there's a lot to be said. But the element in that book which I think had the greatest impact was its investigation of the way song worked. And by song here, I specifically mean art song, which entails the musical composition that gives a home to a pre-existing poetic text. So in other words, it's not like popular song in which you have purpose-written lyrics, right? You go to a poem usually by a poet of some repute within your cultural milieu, and you find a musical way of connecting with that poetry. So that study of the relation between words and music, first in song, then more generally. That was really where I started out. I mean, I ended up in many other places, but that's the place where I started out. And, when I can in English courses at Fordham, I do introduce music to the classes and try to deal with it. I'll give you an immediate example. Currently, I'm teaching a course called The Literature of War. And we have been reading Wilfred Owen. We have been reading Erich Maria Remarque, All Quiet on the Western Front. We're just this week doing Pat Barker, who is a British novelist who wrote something called the Regeneration Trilogy, all about World War I. In the first of those novels, which is called Regeneration, Wilfred Owen, the poet, is a character. So at the beginning of the class tomorrow night, I am going to play for the class and discuss with them the opening of Benjamin Britten's War Requiem, which deals, in fact, with, includes a setting of one of Owen's most famous poems, which is called Anthem for Doomed Youth. And there's an episode in the novel in which Owen and another important poet of the period, Siegfried Sassoon, put their heads together over how to begin this poem. And the fictional episode is based on actual events. We have a manuscript of the poem in which Owen has said, here's the poem with Sassoon's emendations. And then he takes these revisions and makes further revisions and so forth. So we're going to go to this kind of collaborative writing process, to the process of revision, to the process of musical setting 50 or 60 years later, and connect all of these dots.
I want to talk just broadly about the state of the liberal arts in our country today, and the need for the humanities and what's going on there. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, it's a very big topic, and I hesitate at some level to make pronouncements about it. But having duly said that, I will now pronounce freely. Okay. There are three things that are obviously confronting the humanities today which are troubling. And the first of them, the most obvious, is financial. As universities become more and more corporatized and therefore begin more and more to treat their students as consumers rather than as people engaged in a program of self-transformation, the funding tends to go where prevailing cultural trends send it. And the prevailing cultural trends today, for all sorts of reasons, most of them not very good reasons, are away from the humanities. So one thing that we have to deal with is that particular trend. And we have to do our best collectively to make sure that humanities programs remain funded, remain well supported by universities. I think that for the most part, universities which have that as a historic part of their mission do a pretty good job of it. I also think that they are struggling against economic forces which no one can control and which, in sheer scale, are much bigger than they are. So it is and will be an uphill struggle.
Wow.
There were two more.
I was curious about the connection between critical thinking and democracy. There was a famous Princeton University study a couple of years ago which said that the United States is no longer a functioning democracy, that the will of the average citizen is completely left out in terms of politics. Do you think there's a link between that, between having a humanely educated population who, for example, have a sense of empathy? You get a sense of empathy not from business classes. Business classes teach you how to make money. They don't teach you how to have empathy. But you get empathy from poetry, you get empathy from literature. So I think we're lacking empathy, and also, I guess, from philosophy and from history, you get critical thinking to know when your leaders are lying to you or not. Does that make any sense?
Well, except let me amend that at one level. From literature, you get critical thinking. Oh. The most important thing that we teach in the literature classroom is how to think critically, how to read with alertness, with skepticism, with rigor. And it is great that we bring students to read works that we judge to be really important because of their insight, their vision, their empathetic powers, and so forth. But nowadays, as the university properly becomes much more diverse. There's no single set of texts that we can focus on, so it really depends upon the passion of the individual professor. And that's a perfectly good thing, because the thing we all have in common is that sense that you don't read passively, you don't read sheepishly, you read actively. You read so that you can exercise your intelligence and your imagination on the works that you read. But that's an art, and we teach that art. So it's really extremely important. Now, of course, it spills over into philosophy and history. In this war class I was talking about, for example, philosophy hasn't much come into it, but history certainly has, from the Peloponnesian Wars to World War I and the Civil War. So that factors very strongly into this sort of understanding. I think that as far as democracy is concerned, that Princeton report overstates the case. I mean, if I may politicize for a moment, we're in big trouble at the moment. Our democracy is, in fact, facing very serious threats stemming from certain places on Pennsylvania Avenue and elsewhere. But that's not the first time. No. And I think we'll probably manage to survive Trump unless he makes Kim Jong-un too angry. But the other thing is that I think this does not start at the university level. I do not think it starts even at the high school level. I think it starts in grade school. And one of the things that would be the case that would help change the problem that the Princeton report was addressing is if more people went out and voted. We have a democracy available, but not everybody takes advantage of it. And I'll tell you a kind of a personal anecdote. I've always remembered this. It was a really kind of revelatory moment for me. It was in the 9th grade. I had just entered high school. And I had a class which I don't think happens much anymore in this country. It was called civics. And in that class, we read and studied all of the founding documents of the country. We learned about the fundamental framework of law in the United States. We learned about how elections worked and so forth. And I kind of idolized my civics teacher. He was a man named Mr. Hughes. And of course, I have no idea what his first name was, right? Because these were always Mr. So-and-so. Mr. something, right. So it was a wonderful class, and it was really kind of inspiring. And this was where I went to school at this time was a little suburb of New Jersey, near Philadelphia.
What was it called?
It was called it was called Cinnaminson. You've never heard of it?
I actually have.
Oh, you actually have?
Yes,
okay. So one day during that summer, after my freshman year in high school, my family is driving across the bridge between Philadelphia and New Jersey, and we go into the toll plaza, and who should the toll taker be? But Mr. Hughes.
Oh my goodness! Oh.
And I had this sudden blinding revelation. Like a 14-year-old kid, right?
Yes.
The man had to do this because they weren't paying him enough.
Oh,
and he had had a transformative effect on my young life.
Right.
And we didn't give him enough respect to give him a living wage. And I thought to myself, something that a 14-year-old would say. But what I would say right now is that, that was shameful.
Oh my goodness.
And that trouble is that you have to kind of work really hard to make the democracy work. And with more education like I got from him, it would be nice to say that people did that.
This is a wonderful story, and it's interesting because one of our recent guests was Richard Dreyfuss, the actor, who has a civics project. I don't know if you know that. Richard Dreyfuss, the actor, studied at Oxford, I think about 5 or 6 years ago. He went to Oxford for 4 years, and he came out studying civics education, and he created a nonprofit called the Dreyfuss Civics Initiative. And he said what you just said, that we need to get back to basic civics in high school, college, but also in the community to have civics clubs. And so maybe we get you and Dreyfuss together. We could work something out here. Yeah. I would definitely agree with that we have to get back to that. And in fact, I just finished writing an essay for Richard. He's working on a book on this, and he had asked me to write for him. And luckily, I had Dr. Kramer as a professor, so I do know how to write. You made sure I took a lot of notes in your class. I must have them somewhere in the closet. Time is precious. We only have an hour with you on the show. Larry, I can call you Larry. See, once you get to a point, you could call your professors by their first name. It's great. Larry, talking about your passions now, I want our audience to get a sense of, in terms of literature, growing up, let's start with literature, then we'll get to music. Some of your favorite writers.
Some of my favorite writers. Well, another kind of transformative educational experience. As I told you, I think before we started recording, I was an undergraduate at the University of Pennsylvania, but my mother lived in New York, and I tended to spend summers living here, and so on a lark, one summer, I took a course in romantic poetry at Queens College. And I don't remember the professor's name at this point. I do know he was British. Okay. He was coming over as a visitor. He was a young guy, probably an assistant professor. And the course was, again, one of those really memorable things in which I just simply fell in love with Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, Blake, Keats, and Byron. And in fact, that's where I did my dissertation on, was romantic poetry. So that was a kind of nucleus. Now, of course, that was a long time ago, and my tastes have changed since. I do a lot with modernism these days. I'm very absorbed in American modernism. I've been taught some courses on that.
Okay.
And
what are the biggies? What are your favorites?
Well, my favorite of all is Faulkner. I teach him whenever I can. Wallace Stevens, likewise. Yeah. So those are two formidable figures from the era. So that's also one of my strong, compelling interests. And I have also an interest in German literature. So I did Kafka with you. I teach Kafka a lot. I teach Goethe. Teach Heine, particularly in musical connections.
Heine.
Yeah.
Yes.
So those guys. So that's some.
I've been thinking about reading Goethe's great Bildungsroman. Can you talk a little bit about that? What was it, Meister?
Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship. Yeah. Well, it's a wonderful and very absorbing book. It is not like most novels because it's complexly episodic, and there are lots of digressions in it. It's very much a thing of its time, but it does have a through narrative, a very important one, and it is about the transformative effects of education. So it fits into that. It's also set the standard for most coming of age texts that followed it. So I would strongly recommend it. Sure, there's a classic translation by Thomas Carlyle. Okay. So if you want to get a sense of how it would have read to people back when it was still relatively new in the early 19th century, you can read the Carlyle translation. If you're not a big fan of Carlyle's prose, which is Victorian English, there are good modern translations as well.
Now, I want to say something about The Moviegoer, because this is a novel that, and I want to thank two people from Hoboken, New Jersey, Colin and Charlie. They used to facilitate a book club at All Saints Church on the corner of 7th and Washington Street. And for 17 years, they would have book clubs. Once a month there'd be a novel and a discussion over cake and coffee, and one of the novels was The Moviegoer. And so I also wanted to get your input on that, on the importance of book clubs and people discussing literature. But as far as The Moviegoer, this is about a stockbroker from New Orleans, right, who's very bored. He's bored with his life, and certain things give him meaning, a sense of meaning, like riding on buses. He feels like a sense of community, being out with other people, and going to the movies gives his life a sense of meaning. There was a great philosopher of education who I got very close to named Maxine Green. She was over at Teachers College, Columbia, and she would write a lot about The Moviegoer. And she said the importance of that novel has to do with search, going in search. And it's important to be in a quest. And if you're not in a quest or in search, then you're in despair. And I think of all the people in our world today, in our country, who work jobs that they hate, and they get up in the morning and they're just going through the motions. What is your interpretation of that, of The Moviegoer, in terms of being in search, being in quest?
Well, I'll comment on that idea in a minute, but I'm going to shift the venue for a second. of course, the idea of going in search is one of the oldest of all literary ideas, right? So we have two founding texts in the Western literary tradition by quote-unquote Homer, whoever Homer was,
Okay.
and one of which, of course, is the Iliad. It's all about the Trojan War, but the other one, the Odyssey, is about going in quest to get home from the Trojan War. It's where it starts. So the notion of a journey over obstacles, which requires learning and patience and wit, requires all of the characteristics rather that Homer invests in Odysseus, which is interesting because Odysseus is nominally he's a perfectly acceptable warrior, as that culture demanded that its male heroes be, but he gets home not because of his prowess at fighting, but because he's smart. He outwits his obstacles and enemies.
Like those sirens. What about those
And
sirens?
like the sirens, or like the Cyclops, or and so forth. In the end, he does draw a bow and arrow and kill his wife's suitors, but nonetheless, he had to get there. So I think that there's a kind of a literary topic there which I think resonates throughout the history of Western literature. But the other part of what you said, though, which really strikes me as interesting, the question of finding meaning through reading.
Yes, yes.
I think that is also of critical importance. And I'll comment on it both in historical terms, but also in the same sense of the long reach of this idea within our collective Western cultures, plural. All of those cultures that kind of trace their intellectual ancestry to ancient Greece. And that is to say that the first book club was held at the house of a guy named Agathon. And it was attended by this person you may have heard of called Socrates. And when Plato got hold of it, he wrote a kind of transcript of the book club discussion and called it the Symposium.
Oh my goodness.
So the notion that you arrive at some kind of understanding, some kind of philosophical insight through a collective conversation in which people articulate a vision and then have it challenged, goes back to that form. And it has also a long history. And then the other thing, and this is something I think we tend to forget a little bit because we in our particular cultures are kind of used to assuming, not entirely correctly, universal literacy, but the notion of finding yourself in books and finding yourself in talking with others about books took off in a remarkable, accelerated way in the early 19th century with the spread of literacy. Literacy rates soared during this period. Some people have even talked about a revolution in reading. And with it came the growth of lending libraries, and with it came the growth of the notion that you read, you discuss, you read, you discuss some more. And that, in a way, became the model of what we do in universities, because here again, so when did we start teaching literature in universities? Well, nominally, sometime in the early to mid 19th century, although mostly it was classical literature. But then you get into the early 20th century and begin to teach literature in the vernacular, literature in the modern languages. So it's a very recent development, not much more than a century old. But it's based on this conception that it is a way of giving you the tools to transform yourself. Now, I want to make this very clear. Giving you the tools to transform yourself. It's not that you go into the classroom and automatically become edified. It's not that culture is going to make a good person of you, because it isn't. We know all too well. The history shows, people who were very well read and had very good taste and judgment and were aesthetically attuned. Went out and committed mass murder and worse. So no, it's not going to automatically make a better person of you, but it does give you the opportunity to use these intellectual tools, use these imaginative and creative tools to improve your own understanding of yourself, the world, your commitments, your passions, your responsibilities. But it's up to you. You've got to make the intervention yourself. You have to have the will and the resolve to do it. Otherwise, the education is pointless. We don't want smart robots.
No,
Well, we do want
right,
smart robots, but we don't want them to be people.
Right, right. Wow. You know, I have so many things that I could say to respond, and I just, first of all, you mentioned Byron, and I remember getting for Christmas one year, I think from my grandmother, she gave me a copy of Don Juan somewhere around 1990. It was still like a magical totem, you know, like that Don Juan. And some of my favorite writers, you know, Philip Roth. I love Philip Roth. John Updike, who I actually got to meet once, and it was in 2000. It was in 2001 in January. It was at the NJCU where I was teaching at the time, and he was actually there to read a book of poetry. He was actually also a poet, and in the at the wine reception afterwards, I said I have to approach him. He's my hero. You know, I walked up to Updike. You know, he had that white hair, you know, twinkling blue eyes, and I said to him, "Mr. Updike, I'm such a fan of you." I said, "I wish I could write like you." And he looked me in the eye and he said, "You have to write like you." So one of the greatest gifts anybody ever said to me. But like D.H. Lawrence and Henry Miller, what is their place in the American canon?
Well, I don't.
Oh, Lawrence is English, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, in the modern literature. Yeah.
Oh well, I can't really speak to Miller very much.
Okay.
I'm not. I mean, I read him years and years ago. Lawrence, I repeatedly or recurrently have taught over the years. He's also a favorite, and in part because he takes such an antagonistic position to systems of authority, which perpetuate themselves thoughtlessly and smugly and so forth. Lawrence is a great rebel. It's he's most famous for Lady Chatterley's Lover and the use of four-letter words to describe sex and all that. But that's not the most interesting and valuable thing about Lawrence. It's the way in which he situates the desires of individual human beings, sexual and otherwise, within a project once again of very much a Bildung in that German sense of self-transformation, self-cultivation. It fits right in the Goethe tradition. It's just a little more racy. And although actually Goethe can be pretty racy himself. So I mean, I think the coupling of Lawrence and Goethe is probably counterintuitive, but I like it. It sounds good. Wow. And Lawrence is an important modernist. Now, it's interesting that during the latter part of the 20th century, Lawrence fell to some degree into disfavor because of feminist critiques of his work. And as a consequence, was taught less for a while. That may still be true, but I think he has recovered somewhat in the academy. People are beginning once again to teach him. And of course, this was a valuable episode because it brought out aspects of his work that would not otherwise necessarily have been commented on, required people to reckon with things that might make them uncomfortable. I mean, I think Lawrence would have approved. So he fits very much also into the experimental modernism. And another very important figure, also a favorite, one whom also I taught in the war class, is Virginia Woolf. Oh, yes. And Woolf is above all an experimental novelist, someone who uses transformations of literary form to break new ground. So I think that she and Lawrence and Faulkner, I'm interested in the American thing partly just because I'm interested in American culture. And if I can just should have totally shift the ground for a moment. This is apropos of music, just those moments of odd revelation. Because I do compose, and one of the things that I have composed a lot of is song cycles. So music in which groups of poems by individual poets get set to music. The one that's going to be performed tonight is Emily Dickinson.
Tonight?
Yes, tonight.
Talk about tonight's concert.
Oh, okay. Well,
okay, all right.
I'll jump from. I'll get back to it in a second. But the thing is, I realized one day, for no particular reason, that all of the poets whose work I had set to music were American. It wasn't a choice. It wasn't something I was thinking about. It just happened. And I think it has something to do with that interest in the cultural history of the United States. It has something to do with the language, the idiom, which is very much more kind of cued in, and I realized, to American English as opposed to British English. So it's very interesting that should come up. Now, as for the concert tonight here at Fordham, it has two main works on the program. And it's a part of a series that we do here in collaboration with the publication series by Fordham University Press called Poets Out Loud, which is an annual prize series. Excuse me. So this is the 8th of these concerts that we've done. And tonight there are two Fordham persons featured on the program, myself and my colleague Elizabeth Frost, who is one of the editors of the Poets Out Loud series. I'm there in my capacity as a composer. As I said, my piece is 6 songs by Emily Dickinson. And Beth is there as a poet. She wrote a poetic cycle called All of Us. And the entirety of it was set by a composer named Robin Julian Heifetz, who will be here tonight. And these will be, in the case of All of Us, it's a premiere. In my case, it's a half premiere because different versions of this cycle have been performed before. But this one is the product of revision and addition and transformation. So this is the form that I pat on the head and say, "You're mine."
Wow. I just want to respond about how our Emily Dickinson connection here. We've mentioned Emily Dickinson on our show many times because one of my favorite quotes is from her, where she says that imagination lights the slow fuse of the possible. I love that quote, and also, there was that one-woman show on Broadway back in the 70s called The Belle of Amherst, starring Julie Harris. Well, my father, who, when he was a young man, wanted to be an actor, and he was actually in the play where Warren Beatty was discovered for Hollywood back in 1958 at the North Jersey Playhouse in Fort Lee, New Jersey. He had gotten married and decided to sort of give up that acting dream, but wound up always being around show business somehow. He was a projectionist. He worked in theater. He worked in a little theater called the Playhouse on the Mall in Paramus, New Jersey, which has the distinction of being the only theater in a shopping mall in the United States, or the first one in a shopping mall. And it was established by Robert Ludlum, who became a great spy novelist, but this was before his spy novel days. Yeah. So then my dad did one Broadway show, which was The Belle of Amherst, and he did the lighting on that. So lighting and Emily Dickinson and imagination, and how do we speak this to a broad audience? Why literature matters. Let's shift to music now, because that's another big part of your interest. And what are some of the popular songs, like growing up? What was some of the music that you liked as a kid?
Okay, this is a terrible confession.
Okay, go ahead.
As a kid, I did not like popular songs. Really.
Okay.
My family would drive around in the car and the radio would be on, and my sister would demand that they would put on these pop stations, and I would sit there and I would wince.
Oh my goodness, wincing in the back seat. Okay.
Yeah, wincing in the back seat. Now, I have since grown up a little, and there are some popular songs indeed that I do like, but most of them are from the first half of the 20th century, the so-called American songbook. I like Gershwin and Porter and Irving Berlin and Harold Arlen, those people. But of course, why? Why do you like those, Kramer? Yes, of course, because they're closest to the art song. Their forms, their approach to the text, and so that kind of addresses the question you were raising about humanities and popular audience. In some ways, I think I don't usually like to predict the future, but I think that eventually that particular group of songs, I think is well on its way already, is going to be treated in much the same way that we treat songs by Schubert and Schumann nowadays. With the one important exception is that those composers from the past give you fully scored pieces, whereas it is expected with these popular songs that each performance will kind of reinvent it a little bit. So it's a different aesthetic, but nonetheless there's a very important relationship between the music and the words. You can't ignore either part. And that's really quite different from a lot of popular music at the present moment, when you very frequently get a single phrase repeated over and over again as a kind of thing by which you're supposed to remember the song. Obviously, it works. People like it, so you have to say, yeah, fine. This is something that people want to do. Doesn't happen to interest me very much. I guess I have a kind of more humanities-oriented approach to these things. But one of the reasons I'm interested in song as an art form is precisely that it can do, if it's done well, one hopes that one does it well, the thing that you're talking about, kind of extend a certain connection to an art form to an audience. And so take Emily Dickinson, for example. I mean, everybody loves Emily Dickinson. She's an extraordinary figure in American culture and literature. But her poetry is quite difficult. And if you've ever taught it to undergraduates, you'll know how hard they find it. So how do you make Emily Dickinson easy to understand? Well, you don't. How do you make it possible to understand her? Well, a couple of ways. One is take it into the classroom and have the students unpack it, ask them the right questions, ask them, why she does this, why she does that. But another way to do it is to set her poetry to music. And let the emotional flow and the rhythm of the form of the music create an impression which connects to the poem. Let some of the musical expressive potential, which is there and kind of easily apprehensible to the audience, provoke thought about the poetic expression. This is not the old idea of you express in music what the poem expresses in words. That's exactly what you don't do. What you do is create aesthetic, intellectual, and emotional provocations. How do you think about this? How do we feel about this? And if people come away with a thought that hasn't occurred to them before, or say, I never knew it quite felt that way when that line came on, you're doing your work.
Wow. I just want to ask Claudia, dear, to please just pan the camera around just to show you where we are. We always like to situate in space and time that we are in an office. Show baby around. You say these gray file cabinets. I think of Kafka a little bit, right? The Kafkaesque file cabinet, and there's the blackboard. This is about as academic as you can get, which I loved. This part of academic life, and sitting here with Dr. Lawrence Kramer and just having a wonderful soiree about literature and music and philosophy and life, and it's fantastic. Maybe we could switch a little bit just to teaching itself and the joy that you get in the classroom and in terms of how you structure the teaching process. I remember when I took your class, it was a lot of lecturing, and then I also learned as a teacher myself the importance of lecturing and also the importance of group discussion. Talk about that. How much of lecture versus group talk? And
yeah, that's changed over the years, and I think it's changed over the years partly as a result of the way the students have changed over the years. Their own educational preparation has varied. They come equipped with different kinds of knowledge than they used to. And of course, one also has to take advantage of the fact that we live in the digital age, that students are computer literate, that they expect certain ways of understanding which include more than just words on a piece of paper. All of our classrooms here are smart classrooms. We have internet connections. We can look and listen and do research in the classroom itself.
Yeah, that's true.
So
people Google stuff, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So for example, back in my war class, I was teaching the Aeneid. And we were talking, and my students got very, very absorbed in this, and they were dealing with the famous episode of Dido and Aeneas. So in case anybody needs reminding, Aeneas is on his way to found Rome, having been in exile from Troy, and he goes to Carthage, where he's received by the Carthaginian queen, Dido. The two of them fall in love. He kind of thinks about staying in Carthage, but the gods intervene and basically say, nope, you're going to found Rome. That's your destiny.
Okay.
So he departs and leaves Dido to her own devices, and they're bad devices. She kills herself and immolates herself and creates an eternal enmity between Carthage and Rome, and history follows. So we were all very, very absorbed in this discussion. The students had very different views about it. I just kind of sat back and let them talk. It was wonderful. But then at some point, we were interested in the way in which that story had been recycled throughout history. So we did two things. One was to listen to Dido's Lament, a song in which Dido laments the departure of Aeneas, written by the British composer Henry Purcell at the end of the 17th century. So all I had to do was go to YouTube, input Dido's Lament, and there it was in multiple forms. Now, I hadn't planned necessarily that evening to do that, but it seemed like a good thing to do, so bingo, there it was. And then later, we were looking at iconography. We wanted to see how Dido had been portrayed in art. So I thought of a couple of images that I knew of and went back to the computer, and there they were. So you can use this armory of media to encourage discussion. But you asked about lecturing.
Yeah.
I found, and this is a personal impression, okay, so there's no authority behind this statement whatsoever. But in the early parts of my career, which now spans some 40-odd years, I found that students were receptive to fairly lengthy lectures in the classroom, and that was not a barrier to them engaging in discussion. So I could talk for 40 minutes or 45 minutes, and then we could go on and discuss. But as time went by, that became less and less true. And I realized that there was some change was going on. And the change seemed to me to be a change in relationship to the professor as authority. The students wanted to take down what was being said. They wanted to say, this is the way it is, this is the truth. I want to capture this, and if there's an exam, I want to get the right answer. So I said to myself, adjustment needed. We have to find a way to make the students engage more actively. So I began to experiment with various techniques, including group discussions, student seminar presentations, and so forth, to cause their learning to be less passive, more active. And I've moved more and more in that direction. So that currently I require all of my students to come prepared to a class to ask a question about what they've read. And the question can't be a kind of a simple, what does this mean, what does that mean? It's got to be something that raises an issue. It's got to be something for which they set up a context. And it's hard to learn to do that. Most of them begin by struggling with it. But I'm happy to say that so far, at least, by the time we get to mid-semester, most of them have gotten pretty good at it. So, you just have to be alert to what their previous training and also the cultural atmosphere around them is suggesting that they do. Now, also, having praised the digital world a few moments ago, I'm going to criticize it.
Go for it.
Because one of the big problems, and this I think is something that I struggle against in the classroom all the time, is that the availability of the whole universe of information online, the fact that you can Google anything,
Yes.
has tended to create a situation in which knowledge is equated with information. And if it's one thing that the humanities teaches us, is that is not true. Knowledge is what you do with information. And the real task of letting people learn, or encouraging people to learn how to use these things as tools rather than as crutches, as means rather than as ends, is to get them to learn how to use but not be stopped by information, not to think that once they've learned X, Y, Z, that's it. They can put that in their pocket and carry it away. So that's something which I find the students are very receptive to. They, at least within the classroom, they're quite willing to take those extra steps and to value them. I hope that they carry that with them outside the classroom. One thing, of course, that we can't really know is what people will take away once they leave your supervision, quote unquote. But I occasionally hear from former students like yourself,
Here we are.
which gives me encouragement
Nice.
in that arena.
Wow.
A new book just came out, and I just discovered it yesterday. I was in a bookstore, and it was on the front table, a little bookstore in Hoboken, and it's called The Usefulness of Useless Knowledge. The Usefulness of Useless Knowledge. And the book, it's a tiny book, and it's 2 essays, right? One of the essays is by Abraham Wexler, who actually is the guy who started the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton, which brought Einstein to Princeton. And his whole idea is that useless knowledge can be very powerful. And the idea is to get people together just to discuss and follow their curiosities. And I only started reading the book, but it has a lot to do with the arts and the sciences mixing together. Now, a lot of people say what we do, oh, that's not practical. You know, when I was a liberal arts major at Bergen Community College, that's before I came to Fordham, actually. I was studying there, and people would say to me, what are you studying? And I would say liberal arts, and I almost felt embarrassed to say it, you know, like, oh, what are you going to do with that? It's impractical, you know. And then here's a true story. I actually dropped out of college because I had gotten depressed. I was in my early 20s, and I had no direction, and I said, what am I going to do with my life? And dropped out of college, and I found myself a really good psychotherapist named Stephen Knobloch. At the time, he was in Fort Lee, New Jersey. He has gone on to become one of the leading musicologists in his own way. He wrote a book comparing psychotherapy to music called The Musical Edge of Therapeutic Dialogue. Now, in one of the great coincidences of my life, now, it was because of my therapy with Stephen that I got my act together, and I said I got to get back into college because I had dropped out of Bergen Community. Then I came to Fordham, graduated. Took me 8 years at night, okay, because meanwhile I got married and then working and coming here at night. The last day of class, I leave here at Lincoln Center, get on a bus back to Hoboken, New Jersey, which is where I was living. Got off the bus on Hudson Street in Hoboken, and I looked up, and there was Stephen Knobloch. I hadn't seen him in 8 years. He had just moved his practice to Hoboken. Bumped into him. I said, Steve, I said, what a joy to see you. This is my last day of class. What a coincidence. Because of you, I got back into college, and here I am, and here you are. And he said, therapists live for moments like this, you know. Now, I want to bring this story back full circle to you, Larry, because the first class I took here was called Psychoanalysis and Literature. So I want our audience to know that things like psychoanalysis and things like literature can be very life-changing. Professors can be very life-changing. You know, the humanities is a very good thing. We wouldn't have this television show if it wasn't for these experiences. So.
Professors live to hear their former students say things like that.
There you go. They live. Okay. So
Yeah, no, that's, you know, it's actually very practical because what we teach above all is how to think, and if that isn't practical, I don't know what is.
So are we losing our ability to think? I mean, I would like to look at data now, and I'm asking our audience, I'm asking you, anybody who wants to give me data on the number of business majors, okay? Over the past 30 years, I know it's increased a lot, and I think this is a big part of the problem in our society now. And I would see, Bill Gates has way too much power, and I know he's good with computers. Okay, people like Bill Gates, fine for computers, but he's been making a lot of statements on education. And when he talks about education, he doesn't say things like democracy. I saw him on Charlie Rose once, and they were talking about education. I said, come on, what about democracy, Bill? Never mentioned democracy. So I think things like critical thinking, democracy, and also becoming better people. If we're going to have a world that's more peaceful, we have to have peaceful human beings. How are we going to create peaceful, loving human beings if we're just training people like technocrats, right? We're going to make better robots, but we're not going to make better people.
Well, this brings us back to a point that we were talking about very early on, about the value of the humanities. And one of the issues that's confronting the humanities today is the emphasis on so-called STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and so forth. I forget what the M is.
Right.
But you know, these fields are very important to the future economic security of modern nations. So indeed, one has to encourage that education. It's a worthwhile thing to do. And we need people in those fields, just as we need smart business people. I mean, there's nothing to be said against that. But there is something to be said in favor of integrating the curricula which educate those people with humanities curricula, which is something that we do here, certainly. We have an important undergraduate business school, but these students also have to take humanities courses. And the issue is to make sure that when people graduate with a degree, they not only have the particular specialty in which they'll be going to their future careers and so forth, but that they will have, once again, the opportunity to avail themselves of the intellectual equipment to address those issues that you're talking about, issues of knowledge, self-knowledge, transformation, responsibility, inform participants in democracy. It's a cliche at this point that's what democracy needs, but it's also true. So tired though one may be of to say, oh, we've heard this before.
Right.
Yeah, you've heard it before because A, it's always under siege, it's always threatened, and B, it's important. So yeah, we do have that. But the thing is that the emphasis tends to be somewhat one-sided, and the one-sidedness is backed by important economic imperatives. So you have to pull against that. Yeah.
Wow. The other thing was when Sputnik went up, there was this huge interest in science, and it was understandable, right? The Russians got a satellite up there. It's 1958, 59, and what are we going to do? We got to push the sciences and the mathematics. One thing that I heard that happened was that then the English departments felt like they had to hold their head up with the sciences, and a lot of the new criticism and talking about literature in a way that was so abstract and filled with jargon, and does that make any sense? Or
I think the timing is a little different. That rise of theory about which I have fundamentally positive rather than negative feelings really coincided with the political upheavals of the 1960s, and were initially directed at critiques of unquestioned authority. So it's a part of a long tradition in the West, again going back to Plato, of not letting those in charge get away with dictating all of your assumptions. And yeah, it did get a bit too jargon-ridden. It did get a bit Mandarin and exclusive, and there were excesses certainly. But on
created a priesthood.
It did. It did in a way. But on the other hand, it took risks. It challenged people to think in new ways, and the positive results, the valuable results. The wheat and the chaff get separated, and the new generation of thinkers has come in who are somewhat less prone to that kind of creation of an artificial language, but they've integrated the results of earlier thinkers. When Steve Bannon talks about deconstructing the administrative state, the use of the word deconstruction in that sentence actually is significant.
It is.
Very dumb. Yeah, exactly. So these things travel, and the good parts get retained, and the not so good parts get left behind. And that's true of every important thinker, going all the way back to Empedocles. So that's just a normal educational process. I do think that a couple of things are going on right now of great importance in the humanities. And, I don't want to say a word against science. I mean, I think science is fabulous, and I think the scientific worldview is really important.
Right.
So, but part of the problem for literature throughout the past century, the 20th century, was the felt need to rival science for intellectual authority. And the struggle to find models of understanding which could do that was very difficult, and also doomed to failure, because there is just no such thing. The humanities depend upon a certain vulnerability of their claims. Now, of course, scientists will tell you that they do too, but scientists have particular techniques to make use of that vulnerability, from the demand for replication to the notion that you do experiments and report your failures as well as your successes and so forth. No equivalent quite in the humanities. So ultimately, I think it came time for the humanities to recognize that there was no fighting this. They had to redefine their relationship to scientific knowledge. And that's an ongoing project. It happens to be one which right now is taking the form of a kind of synergy, in which various kinds of scientific inquiry, particularly into matters of the environment, of the kind of the so-called eco-criticism, of the relationship between the human footprint on the planet and the destiny of everything else, the idea that we're living in the so-called age of the Anthropocene, in which the decisive factor in life on Earth is the human impact. All of these things are coming together, and a lot of people in the humanities are taking that on board and writing about it. And at the same time, people thinking about science, figures like Bruno Latour, for example, are arguing that the sciences are actually more like the humanities than they were often thought to be. And so gradually, there's a kind of not exactly a full convergence, but a kind of a mutual reciprocal understanding that the fundamental acts of inquiry in both of these areas have many, many points of contact. There is no opposition between the humanities and science. Wow. There may be points on which they disagree, points on which their methods diverge, but globally speaking, both are essential and they're in dialogue with each other.
Wonderful. So we finally resolved the famous C.P. Snow paradox, right? The two cultures are actually dancing together in a way that wasn't really thought. As we start to wind up, again, this is such a delight and pleasure to be with you, Larry. I hope that we get to continue our conversation on the air, off the air. It is springtime in New York. There are tulips outside, and so I have to say, I like New York in spring. What about you? A little music in the air, a little levity to one of the great musicologists of our country, of our world. We didn't get too much into the music. Maybe next time we could talk more about that, but we went on this labyrinth, wonderfully wandering path. Maybe, since this is a teacher-student thing here, you were a student of Harold Bloom, and he has a new book out. Maybe you could say a little shout-out to Harold.
Well, yes. I mean, he is, of course, one of the great intellectual prodigies of our time. So it was very interesting, challenging to study with him. But, Bloom Schmoom, I'm going to plug myself. I have a book out this year. I had one out last year. I've produced 19 of them, so I'm not any slouch myself. Thank you very much.
Oh, how wonderful. And what are you reading right now? What's exciting to you when you're reading life? We have 1 minute left.
1 minute left. Actually, I just mentioned Bruno Latour. So I'm not reading, but rereading his important book, We Have Never Been Modern. And it talks about the very things that I was talking about a few minutes ago. And then there's a book which I'm going to turn to when I finish that, which is by a woman named I'm gonna blank on this. Her first name is Salome, but I can't recall the last name for a moment. But anyway, it's a book about listening. It's a book about orality, and it looks really very interesting. And I whatever your last name is, I'm sorry I forgot it, but when I cite your book, it will be there.
We're all going to try to be better listeners as well. So we're with Dr. Larry Kramer here on the corner of 60th and Columbus in Manhattan at the wonderful campus of Fordham University, a place for me, a transformational place in my growth and my life story. And you were one of my great teachers, sir, and I thank you so much for being my teacher, and I thank you for being on our show.
Thank you for having me. It's been really fun.